On the afternoon of October 22nd, 1777,
Hold your fire until they reach the mark.
along a low bluff overlooking the Delaware River, 400 American soldiers stood behind earthen walls, watching nearly 2,000 of Europe's most feared professional soldiers march toward them in perfect formation. The Americans were outnumbered 5-1. Most of the men lining those walls had never faced Hessian grenadiers in open battle before. What was about to happen in the next hour would decide whether Philadelphia, newly captured by the British, could actually be supplied, and whether the Continental Army itself could survive the winter that followed. To understand why this obscure river fort mattered so much, it helps to understand what had happened just weeks earlier. In September 1777, General William Howe's British Army had outmaneuvered George Washington and marched into Philadelphia, the capital of the rebellious American colonies. Capturing the city was a symbolic triumph, but a city is only as useful as its supply lines, and Philadelphia's lifeline ran along the Delaware River. The problem for Howe was that the river was not yet his. The Continental Army had built a chain of obstacles beneath the water, sharpened iron-tipped logs called chevaux-de-frise, designed to rip open the hull of any ship that tried to pass. Guarding those obstacles were two American strongholds, Fort Mifflin on a marshy island in the river, and Fort Mercer on the New Jersey shore at a place called Red Bank. Without control of both forts, British warships could not reach Philadelphia. Without those ships, Howe's army in the city faced a slow, strangling shortage of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. So the forts had to fall, and Howe decided Fort Mercer would fall first. The garrison waiting for him was small, poorly resourced, and, in the eyes of many British officers, unworthy of serious concern. Roughly 400 Continental soldiers, largely drawn from Rhode Island regiments, held the fort under the command of Colonel Christopher Greene, a cousin of the more famous General Nathaniel Greene. Fort Mercer itself was unfinished. Its earthworks had been redesigned only weeks earlier by a young French volunteer engineer, Louis de Fleury, who had convinced Greene to abandon part of the fort's original perimeter and pull the defenses inward, creating a smaller, denser stronghold with a killing ground in front of it. It was an unglamorous practical decision. It would prove to be the difference between annihilation and victory. Howe entrusted the assault to Colonel Emil von Donop, an ambitious and capable Hessian officer eager to restore his reputation. Von Donop had commanded troops at the Battle of Trenton the previous December, when a garrison of Hessians under Colonel Johann Rall was destroyed in a surprise American attack. Von Donop had not been present that day, but the defeat still shadowed the reputation of Hessian arms in America. Taking Fort Mercer, a target defended by what he assumed were a few hundred untested provincial troops, seemed like an opportunity to settle the score. On the morning of October 22nd, von Donop led roughly 2,000 men across from Philadelphia and marched them south along the New Jersey shore toward Red Bank. These were not ordinary troops. Many were grenadiers, tall, hand-picked soldiers wearing tall, brass-fronted caps, trained for shock assaults and close-quarters violence. Their reputation preceded them across Europe. Few American militia commanders wanted to face them in the open field. By early afternoon, the Hessian column arrived within sight of Fort Mercer. Von Donop sent forward a demand for surrender, warning that if the Americans forced him to take the fort by storm, no quarter would be given. Colonel Greene refused. There would be no negotiation. The defenders would fight. What von Donop did not fully appreciate was that the fort he was looking at was not the fort his scouts had reported. Fleury's redesign had abandoned the northern half of the original perimeter. leaving what appeared to be an outer wall standing empty and undefended. A wall that led nowhere, opening onto a second hidden line of defense, bristling with cannon and muskets, aimed directly across an open field. As the Hessian drums began to beat and the columns advanced, they split into two attacking forces, intending to strike the fort from multiple directions at once. One column pushed toward what they believed was the fort's vulnerable northern flank. They scaled the outer wall with discipline and speed, expecting to break through into the heart of the position. Instead, they found themselves standing inside an empty enclosure, exposed on open ground, with the fort's real defenses waiting just beyond. Cannon loaded with grapeshot, and Rhode Island infantry standing ready behind a second wall, muskets leveled. The volley that followed was devastating. At close range, American artillery tore through the tightly packed Hessian ranks. Officers fell in the first moments of the assault. Von Donop himself, leading the second column against the fort's southern face, was struck down, severely wounded, as his men tried and failed to force their way across the same killing ground. For a force renowned across Europe for its discipline under fire, the collapse was swift. Within roughly 40 minutes, the assault that had begun with confident drumbeats ended in chaos, the Hessian ranks broken and retreating, leaving their wounded commander and hundreds of casualties behind on the field. American losses that day were remarkably light, numbering only in the dozens. Hessian losses numbered in the hundreds, killed, wounded, or captured, out of a force that had marched in expecting an easy victory. Von Donop was carried from the field mortally wounded. He died 3 days later at a nearby farmhouse, reportedly telling those around him that he was dying a victim of his own ambition. Whether or not those exact words survive with certainty in the historical record, what is not in doubt is the scale of the disaster for Hessian arms that afternoon, and the shock it sent through British command in Philadelphia. The failure at Fort Mercer did not stand alone. Days earlier, British warships attempting to force their way past the river obstacles near Fort Mifflin had run aground and come under fire, with one vessel, the 64-gun HMS Augusta, catching fire and exploding after a prolonged bombardment. Between the naval disaster and the ruin of von Donop's assault, British efforts to open the Delaware had, for the moment, failed completely on every front. The consequences reached far beyond the walls of one small fort. For weeks after Red Bank, the Delaware River remained closed to large-scale British shipping. Howe's army, sitting inside Philadelphia, was forced to rely on slower, more vulnerable overland supply routes, while engineers worked out how to finally clear the obstacles and force the American positions. Every week that the river stayed shut was a week that gave Washington's army, encamped and exhausted after a difficult campaign season, room to breathe, reorganize, and prepare for the winter ahead at Valley Forge. Fort Mifflin would eventually fall in November, battered into rubble by sustained bombardment, and Fort Mercer's garrison would ultimately withdraw as British pressure on the river mounted. In the narrowest military sense, the Delaware campaign ultimately ended in British success. The river was cleared and Philadelphia was resupplied. But the cost of that success, paid first and most painfully at Red Bank, mattered enormously. The destruction of von Donop's assault force stripped away the aura of invincibility that had clung to Hessian troops since their arrival in America, and it demonstrated something the Continental Army badly needed proof of that autumn: that a small, determined garrison behind well-designed defenses could stand against Europe's finest infantry and win decisively. news of the victory spread quickly through the colonies, offering a rare moment of unambiguous triumph in a campaign season that had otherwise gone badly for Washington's forces. It was proof, at a moment when proof was desperately needed, that the war was not already lost. Today, Fort Mercer survives as a preserved, historic site along the New Jersey shore, its earthwork still tracing the outline of the walls that Louis de Fleury redesigned in the weeks before the attack. Few visitors walking the quiet grounds realize how narrow the margin was on that October afternoon in 1777. How a young engineer's decision to abandon half a fort's perimeter and a small garrison's refusal to break under the sight of grenadiers advancing in formation helped keep a river closed, an army supplied, and a revolution alive through one more difficult winter.